Have you ever felt as though your own mind was working against you? For many of us, anxiety is not just an occasional visitor but a persistent, uninvited guest that shadows our every move. It colors our perceptions, dictates our choices, and often leaves us feeling paralyzed by a future that hasn't even happened yet. We live in an era where stress is considered a status symbol, yet the internal cost of this constant pressure is a rising tide of chronic worry. But what if the key to silencing this internal alarm didn't lie in simply trying harder to be calm, but in understanding the sophisticated biological machinery that generates these feelings in the first place? In this exploration of the human psyche, we are going to pull back the curtain on the most complex organ in the known universe, your brain. Specifically, we are going to look at the intricate relationship between the ancient, emotional centers of the brain and the modern, thinking parts that make us uniquely human. By understanding the neuroscience of anxiety, you will move from a position of victimhood to one of empowerment. You will learn why your brain sometimes sounds a false alarm, and more importantly, how you can retrain those neural pathways to find a sense of lasting peace. This journey is about more than just managing symptoms. It is about a fundamental shift in how you relate to your internal world. We will preview the distinct pathways that lead to fear and worry, providing you with a roadmap to navigate your own mental landscape. Whether you struggle with a constant hum of what-ifs or sudden spikes of panic, the insights contained within these pages will offer a bridge from confusion to clarity. This is your guide to reclaiming your life from the grip of anxiety, backed by the latest findings in brain science. By the end of this journey, you will possess a toolkit of strategies that are not just theoretical, but biologically grounded, allowing you to transform your relationship with fear forever. To understand anxiety, we must first recognize that it is not a monolithic experience. It is a multifaceted biological process that originates in two very different parts of the brain. On one hand, we have the amygdala, an ancient structure dedicated to survival, which processes emotions and triggers the body's immediate physical responses. On the other hand, we have the cortex, the highly evolved outer layer of the brain responsible for logic, language, and imagination. In this book, we will explore the two-pathway model of anxiety. We will examine how the cortex can inadvertently fuel the amygdala's fire through the stories it tells and the images it creates. We will dive deep into the concept of cortex-based anxiety, which is the type of distress born from our thoughts, ruminations, and interpretations of the world around us. The main themes of our exploration will center on the idea of neuroplasticity, the brain's remarkable ability to change and reorganize itself. We will set the expectation that, while you cannot simply think your way out of every anxious feeling, you can certainly influence the thinking patterns that contribute to your distress. By identifying the specific ways your cortex interprets reality, you can begin to dismantle the habits of worry and catastrophizing that have kept you stuck. This orientation serves as your foundation, preparing you to look at your anxiety not as a character flaw, but as a biological process that can be understood, managed, and eventually redirected. When we picture the human brain, most of us visualize a gray, wrinkled mass that resembles a walnut. This outer layer is known as the cortex, and it is the seat of our highest functions. It is what allows us to compose symphonies, solve complex mathematical equations, and plan for a retirement that is decades away. However, this incredible evolutionary gift comes with a significant downside. The cortex is also a master architect of anxiety. While the amygdala, the brain's emotional center, is responsible for the fight or flight response, the cortex is responsible for the what-if response. It operates through thoughts, mental imagery, and the complex structure of language. To understand how the cortex contributes to your anxiety, we must first distinguish its role from that of the amygdala. Think of the amygdala as a security guard who reacts instantly to a perceived threat without waiting for all the facts. It creates emotional memories and initiates physiological responses like a racing heart or sweaty palms. This happens almost instantaneously, and often without our conscious consent. The cortex, conversely, is the analyst in the back room. It doesn't produce the feeling of anxiety directly. The amygdala is still the part of the brain that flips the panic switch. But the cortex is incredibly skilled at providing the amygdala with reasons to be afraid. There are two primary ways the cortex prompts the amygdala to initiate an anxiety response. The first involves the interpretation of sensory information. Imagine you are walking home late at night on a quiet street. Suddenly, a fire truck screams past you, its sirens wailing and lights flashing. Your cortex receives this sensory data, the loud noise and the bright lights, and begins to interpret it. If your cortex decides to spin a narrative that the truck is heading toward your street, it might lead you to the terrifying conclusion that your own house is on fire. This thought, manufactured in the cortex, sends a distress signal to the amygdala, which then triggers a full-blown panic response. You might find yourself sprinting the rest of the way home, your heart pounding, all because of a story your cortex created based on a passing siren. The second way the cortex generates anxiety is even more insidious because it doesn't require any external input at all. It can create anxiety entirely from within, using only your thoughts and imagination. This internal generation of fear is often split between the two hemispheres of the brain. The left hemisphere tends to focus on verbal thoughts, the voice in your head that worries about your performance at work or a conversation you had yesterday. The right hemisphere is more involved in mental imagery, the vivid movies you play in your mind of yourself failing a presentation or getting into a car accident. A classic example of this cortex-based anxiety is the common experience of driving to work and suddenly being struck by the thought, "Did I turn off the stove?" There is no smoke in the car, no smell of gas, and no actual evidence of danger. Yet, the mere thought of the stove being on is enough to ignite a firestorm of worry. You begin to imagine your kitchen in flames, your belongings destroyed, and your life in ruins. This is a purely cognitive process. Your cortex has taken a simple doubt and amplified it into a catastrophe, forcing the amygdala to react as if the fire were happening right now. This leads us to the concept of worry. Humans have a unique ability to anticipate negative outcomes, a trait that is largely absent in the rest of the animal kingdom. Consider a pet cat. A cat can spend the entire afternoon napping in a sunbeam, perfectly content. It doesn't lie awake wondering if there will be enough kibble in the bowl tomorrow, or if the other cats in the neighborhood think it's lazy. The cat lives in the present because its cortex is not developed enough to simulate complex future scenarios. Humans, however, are constantly living in the future. We use our ability to plan and predict to try and avoid pain, but this often backfires, leading us to worry about events that have a statistically near zero chance of occurring. The danger of this constant worry is that the brain is highly adaptive. There is a principle in neuroscience that neurons that fire together, wire together. This means that the more time you spend ruminating on a specific worry, the stronger the neural pathways for that worry become. You are essentially digging neural grooves in your cortex. If you spend hours every day obsessing over a mistake you made or a potential problem, you are training your brain to make that thought process easier and more automatic. This is why rumination, the act of repeating thoughts or conversations over and over in your mind, is so destructive. It doesn't lead to a solution. It simply deepens the habit of anxiety. Beyond simple worry, the cortex employs several other cognitive styles that fuel anxiety. One of the most common is catastrophizing, where you take a small setback and leap to the worst-case scenario. If you make a minor error on a report, catastrophizing tells you that you will be fired, lose your home, and end up destitute. Another is perfectionism, the relentless drive to avoid any mistake, which keeps the cortex in a state of high alert. Negative and pessimistic thinking patterns also play a role, as they prime the cortex to look for threats rather than opportunities. Finally, obsessions and compulsions can trap the mind in a loop of repetitive thoughts and behaviors, making it feel impossible to escape the cycle of dread. Take a moment to reflect on your own mental habits. When you feel anxious, Is it because of something happening in the moment, or is it because of a story your cortex is telling you? Are you stuck in a neural groove of your own making? Recognizing these cortex-based thoughts is the first step toward changing them. Once we recognize that the cortex is often the source of our distress, the question becomes, how do we stop it? To illustrate the power of the cortex to distort reality, let's look at the story of Jenny, a high school senior waiting for news from her dream college. One afternoon, a thick envelope arrives in the mail. Instead of feeling excitement, Jenny is instantly gripped by a cortex-based narrative. She looks at the envelope and knows it contains a rejection letter. She imagines the disappointment on her parents' faces and the embarrassment of telling her friends. For several days, the letter sits unopened on her desk, a physical manifestation of her fear. She spends those days in a state of deep worry, mourning a future she believes is already lost. However, when she finally gathers the courage to open the envelope, she discovers she hasn't been rejected at all. She's been offered admission with a scholarship. Jenny's experience is a perfect example of what scientists call cognitive fusion. This occurs when we become so entangled with our thoughts that we lose the ability to distinguish them from objective facts. Jenny treated her thought, "I am rejected," as an absolute truth, even though the evidence was literally sitting inside the envelope waiting to be discovered. We all do this to some extent. We have a thought like "nobody likes me" or "I'm going to fail," and we treat it as if it were a law of physics. The reality is that the things we anticipate are almost always much worse than the actual situations we eventually face. The most effective way to combat cortex-based anxiety is to change your relationship with your thoughts. You don't necessarily have to stop the thoughts from appearing, but you must learn to view them with a healthy dose of skepticism. Just because your brain produces a thought doesn't mean that thought is true, helpful, or worthy of your attention. You can learn to see your worries as mental noise rather than breaking news. One of the most powerful tools for achieving this distance is mindfulness. Mindfulness is the practice of observing your thoughts and feelings from a detached, objective perspective. Imagine sitting on the bank of a river and watching leaves float by. Each leaf represents a thought. You don't try to grab the leaves, stop them, or change their direction. You simply acknowledge their presence and let them pass. When you apply this to anxiety, you might notice a thought like, "I'm worried I'll mess up this meeting." Instead of getting caught up in that thought, you simply say to yourself, "I'm having a thought that I might mess up the meeting." This small linguistic shift creates a space between you and the anxiety, loosening its grip on your emotions. To further understand this, consider the metaphor of your cortex as a television set with an infinite number of cable channels. When you are anxious, it's as if you have become stuck on the anxiety channel. This channel broadcasts 24/7 coverage of your failures, your fears, and every possible disaster. Most people try to fix this by arguing with the television. They yell at the screen or try to prove the broadcast wrong. But focusing on the screen and arguing with it only keeps your attention locked on that channel. The more you fight the thoughts, the more power you give them. The better strategy is to simply change the channel. This is where the power of distraction comes in. Because the cortex can only focus on a limited amount of information at once, you can intentionally redirect your attention to something else. This isn't about running away from your problems. It's about giving your brain a break from the anxiety loop. You might listen to a complex piece of music, lose yourself in a gripping novel, watch a comedy that makes you laugh out loud, or engage in a high-intensity workout. Even playing a game on your phone can be enough to break the cycle of rumination. These activities engage the cortex in a different way, making it harder for it to continue sending distress signals to the amygdala. Another vital technique is the replacement of anxious thoughts. It is a well-known psychological fact that trying to suppress a thought usually makes it stronger. This is often called the pink elephant effect. If I tell you, whatever you do, do not think about a pink elephant, what is the very first thing that pops into your mind? A pink elephant, of course. The same thing happens with anxiety. If you tell yourself, "Stop worrying about the presentation," your brain has to think about the presentation just to remember what it's not supposed to be thinking about. Instead of trying to erase a thought, you should aim to replace it with what the authors call coping thoughts. A coping thought is a more balanced, productive alternative to an anxious one. For instance, if your cortex is screaming, "There's no use trying, I'll just fail anyway." You don't try to force that thought to disappear. Instead, you consciously introduce a new thought. "I am going to try my best, because even if I don't get the perfect result, there is a chance I will succeed or at least learn something." You aren't lying to yourself or pretending things are perfect. You are simply providing your cortex with a more constructive narrative to follow. Over time, consistently practicing these strategies, mindfulness, distraction, and the use of coping thoughts, can actually physically change your brain. You are effectively rewiring your cortex, weakening the old, anxious neural grooves and building new, more resilient pathways. It takes time and repetition, but eventually, the anxiety channel will no longer be the default setting for your mind. As we conclude this exploration into the mechanics of the mind, it is important to remember the fundamental lesson. Your anxiety is not you. It is a biological process generated by specific pathways in your brain, each requiring a different approach to manage. We have seen how the amygdala operates in the realm of raw emotion and physical survival, reacting to triggers with a speed that bypasses our conscious thought. To calm this ancient part of the brain, we must use physical strategies like deep breathing, muscle relaxation, and exposure therapy to create new, safer emotional memories. However, we have also spent a great deal of time looking at the cortex, the thinking brain, and its role as the narrator of our lives. We have learned that while the cortex is responsible for our greatest achievements, it is also the source of the worry, rumination, and catastrophizing that can make life feel unbearable. The key takeaway is that because the cortex operates through thoughts and images, it is uniquely susceptible to the strategies of mindfulness, distraction, and cognitive replacement. By understanding the distinction between these two pathways, you gain the power to choose the right tool for the job. When you feel the physical surge of panic, you know to focus on your body and your breath. When you find yourself caught in a loop of what-ifs, you know to change the mental channel or challenge the validity of your thoughts. This knowledge is your greatest defense. The journey toward a calmer life is not about the total elimination of anxiety. Fear is, after all, a necessary part of being human. Instead, it is about moving from a state of being overwhelmed by your brain to a state of directing it. You now have the insights and the techniques to begin digging new neural grooves, ones defined by resilience rather than worry. As you move forward, carry with you the understanding that your brain is plastic and capable of change. Every time you choose a coping thought over a catastrophe or mindfulness over rumination, you are literally reshaping your future. The power to change your mind and your life is quite literally within your grasp. For more book summaries for free, install Zyroverse.